Dan Anderson received his BA in English from the University of New Mexico and moved on to a graduate career at the University of Texas at Austin, where, under the mentorship of John Slatin at UT's Computer Writing and Research Lab, Dan learned the fine art of tweaking teaching by applying technical patches. His recent work has focused on the ways in which social networks are reshaping the fields of composition and instructional technology. He has been intently studying and practicing the development of open-source content management systems for class use, and finds that these platforms further extend students' abilities to create and distribute new media texts, but also bring into sharp relief the social dimensions of learning. He has found that building collaborative communities using CMS social networking features enacts best practices in decentered teaching, and that these spaces, combined with prosumer approaches, can create a synergy that translates into student engagement and authentic learning. Welcome, Dan. Are you ready to begin?
Yeah. Hello, everybody. I am Dan Anderson. I am at the University of North Carolina. I'd like to start by thanking Amy and Jessica and Jean-Pierre for organizing this and for having me, and give you a little bit of information about the logistics. I'm not using a PowerPoint. I have a website, and when I bring my screen up, I can do that now, actually. You'll see the URL. I'm not sure how large the image that you have shows up, so I hopefully have got the URL large enough. One of the things that I'm trying to do during this session is show some videos, and I understand that the webinar format is a challenge for that. So if you go to the website here, and you can follow along the videos that I'm showing. I have some screenshots that I'll demonstrate, but you can also watch the video yourself. I'm not sure if you're familiar with some of the various perspectives on multitasking and the way that it reshapes our brain. It might be more of a challenge to try to watch the video while the webinar is going on and what have you, but you can always come back later and do that as well. And I'll do my best to translate these screenshots into what the videos actually look like. So I'm talking about mix and mash genres, and I'm not sure if you're familiar, but there are these things called Mashup Trailers, and I won't show one of these because, again, the video might cause a problem. But if you go online and you search for some of these, you see these things where, films like The Shining, this is probably one of the most popular ones, has been remixed by adding a different audio track to turn the horror film into a romantic comedy. So there's this notion of taking one item and then taking another item that's somewhat disparate and bringing those together and creating a new project. So one of the things I want to talk about in terms of these mashups is what can you get when you take that approach, and where does it go? Often I teach courses for first-year students. I don't get to teach composition courses as much as I would like, but I found that the point that I want to make about how you can create assignments that blend elements of one assignment with another, or particularly that work with genres in a way that doesn't think of them as completely fixed, but as things that can be mixed together, that are hybrid in a lot of ways, I think will translate to almost any educational situation. So the projects I show you, you might think, well, I could never do that in a first-year course. I'm happy to talk about some of the logistics, and it turns out over the years it's gotten a lot easier to do some of these projects. But the approach itself, I think, can be adapted, and I'll try to talk about some of the pedagogical rationales for that as well. So let's start. We'll look at a mashup that one of my students made, and again, you'll be looking at some screenshots, so you'll have to kind of fill in the blanks for some of this moving. This student took the film trailer for Boogie Nights, which is related to the porn industry, and he mashed that together with film items from the movie Hercules, which was a Disney movie. I think his impulse at the beginning came from some instructions that I gave the students. I suggested that, if you want to mash something up, it helps to have disparate items. If you take something that's very, very similar and you mix it with something else, you won't get that traction of parody or irony that comes through these projects. So his thinking was, well, let's take something that's very adult-oriented and I'll mix it with a Disney film, and that's going to create a mashup. And essentially that's how he chose his materials. But there was some insights that developed after a while as he did that. Composing this thing, in some ways it's not that complicated. There's an audio track from one item and then video that's cut up from the other items. And if you go listen to this at some point, you'll hear the trailer from the Boogie Nights film is playing while clips from Hercules have been split up. The clips, he ended up working through the entire film and picking out areas that seem to match with particular instances of the trailer. And that gets a little bit complicated in terms of the voices that are speaking in the visual element that's on the screen need to be lined up with the audio for the trailer. So there's some synchronizing that takes place in the composing of these. And as he put that together, he did some things to add a sense of coherence to it. So after he had one item mixed with the other item, he, at the beginning, created a new preview screen that adds a bit of humor and sets up the way that these projects are going to be blended together. And then at the end, he created a new closing screen that took the Boogie Nights motif and folded in the Hercules figure using a graphic program. So that is the basic mashup that he worked on. And then here are the things that are interesting about that. And what he discovered was that the idea of just taking two disparate items didn't actually pan out in some ways. A lot of my students were working with that same philosophy and ran into trouble. And he realized that what made his mashup work was a sense of complementarity between the two items that he chose. So yes, one was aimed at an adult audience and one was aimed at an audience of children or families. But what really made these two items work together was that they actually had similar storylines of, you know, somebody persevering, making it big, struggling, meeting challenges. It turns out that the narrative of the two films tracks reasonably well. So you have this dual purpose, two approaches that lead to success for these projects. And one is there has to be some difference, something that shakes things up a little bit, but enough sense in which the things fit together that it actually makes sense in the story tracks as you move these along. So that's the philosophy that I want to pick up on and recommend for these kinds of projects, and not just these projects, but for teaching in general. I think as teachers, as you craft assignments, it's worth thinking about that. If you roll forward an assignment over and over again, it's not always the most engaging for you or your students in some ways, but if you completely change to something totally different, then it might not meet the goals that you have. If you can find this middle ground of some difference, some change, but also things that complement the goals that you have, I think that works out really well as you start to craft assignments, and I'll talk about that a little bit more. The other thing related to that is one of the largest challenges that I think instructors face is motivation in the classroom. And I have found that these kinds of projects, when you have this mixing sort of tuned just right, lead to a pretty interesting bit of motivation. The mashup assignment is maybe not the best illustration. I have on the website, I showed you some links to playlists, and those make a really good example, because if you, let's say you're asking students to do a profile essay, that's pretty straightforward, and the genre of the profile essay, students can get it. It's not that hard. And one of the challenges with that is if it's too familiar, then the level of investment actually goes down inversely in some ways. If students know what it is, know how long it takes, they might write it the night before. It's not as challenging. So in that particular assignment, I will ask students to create a playlist related to the figure that they're trying to profile, and not just a list of songs, but annotate the playlist with explanations, analyzing the music and detailing how it fits with traits of the person that they're talking about. And what happens is, because it's a familiar task, I'm profiling somebody, but it's an unfamiliar implementation of it. I'm doing this musical profile. The level of challenge goes up, and you get this kind of happy medium between something that is doable, but also unfamiliar enough that it kind of raises people's antenna a little bit. So I think this kind of mashup mentality, which isn't just take two things and cram them together, but think about the way that two things have enough difference but also complement each other enough to actually work, is helpful for teachers as you're crafting assignments, and it's also helpful for students to try to get them motivated in the class. So that's essentially, you know, the Mashup video trailer is the poster project for how you can mix things together, but it's more nuanced than just taking two things and sticking them in a video editor. There's kind of choosing the right things is important in the beginning. The next thing I want to talk about or show you are screencasts. And when I work with screencasts, the thing that I like to think about there in terms of genres and composing and teaching is what I call working against the grain. And the way to illustrate that is, if you've seen screencasts, let's say you're trying to learn how to use some feature of Microsoft Word. A screencast is a video recorder that captures whatever is happening on the screen. So, you know, a software entity like Microsoft might create a video that shows people how to insert a picture into a word processor document. And they'll turn on the recorder, go to the File menu, and show the Insert option. And it's a way of creating tutorials, showing people how to conduct actions on screen. I like to, what I call, work against the grain with these things. So if the tool is designed to do something, record your screen to create tutorials, what can you do with it that might open up new possibilities that are a little bit different? So what I asked my students to do was use this screen recording software, but instead of just recording a how-to video, create an essay, something akin to what you might ask them to do in a 6-page paper. So that's what this project is. It's an essay about the book Watchmen and the Vietnam War. And you can see one of the things that these screencasts do is they create this sense of performance on the screen. When you turn on the recorder, you may have seen some of these videos as well. You can start typing, for instance, in a search box, and you will record that action and make a movie. So this is a screenshot of the opening part of her video screencast, where she is conducting a web search for the Vietnam War. I'm going to try to be a little tricky and go to my next image by just doing this. So you see these search results come up, and the screen recorder is capturing them. One of the things to note about this is just the range of materials that become available. If you make your composing space the screen of your computer, in some ways everything that your computer can plug into and get access to becomes some of the raw materials. That raises interesting challenges, immediately prompts students to start thinking about, you know, selection criteria, what are they trying to accomplish. A lot of composing questions are introduced as they start to work with this. And then, so her essay is going along, and in the essay she provides a fair amount of background on the Vietnam War. If you listen to the screencast that she's put up there, you'll hear that she adds narration. And this is another thing that you can think about as you compose these with these genres. There's a number of moves that are associated with them, and one of them has to do with using your voice, which opens a lot of nice questions as well about, you know, what is oral communication in our classrooms, and how can it be translated into compositions themselves. So anyway, she's narrating while this is playing, giving background on the Vietnam War. And one of the points I would make there as well is this is not that different than from what you might find in a typical essay. Then she wants to talk about the graphic novel Watchmen. Rather than just switch to the graphic novel Watchmen, since she's recording her screen, she found a video clip of a cartoon that sets up this premise about, you know, superheroes and their kind of innate goodness and how they protect the world, and this is a transition for her. So in some ways she's using this screencasting software to create a transition in her essay from the background information that she's provided on the war, and she's going to swing that over and now start talking about the book that she's going to analyze as well. So this is serving that purpose. And then we get to one of the things that these projects work well for too are analyzing materials on screen. So this is a scan of a page from the graphic novel Watchmen, and she's able to start using her reading skills and interpreting the story. She's now layering over a close reading of the text on top of the information that she set up earlier in her essay. Not that different than what you might find in a print essay. Other things that start to happen is there becomes this kind of synthesis. So she's picking out a key scene from the graphic novel Watchmen, and then you can see later on in the essay she connects that with some of the historical material. So in addition to providing the background and then analyzing the text in some ways, she's now moving toward a mode of synthesis and showing how elements in the graphic novel Watchmen are calling on this historical background from the Vietnam War. Another thing that she wraps up with is you can do close reading of text. A lot of these screencasts can actually function as a way of taking print materials and turning them into video or digital form, and you can zoom in and focus on a passage and close read it and highlight different bits of text. So those are screencasts, and one of the things I would say related to that is in some ways the genre is very similar to a typical essay. If I ask my student to, trace the motif of the Vietnam War in this graphic novel and provide historical context and then close read the novel, that is all happening in this piece, but it's happening in a more performative way through these materials that are on the screen. Those seem like they're a little bit crazy in terms of the technology that you have to use. You use the screencasting software. For the mashups, you use video editing software. But honestly, the projects probably took 2 or 3 weeks. They were not really that much more challenging than typical activities you might do in a class. There are some questions about access to technology and getting everyone going with these programs, but it wasn't that challenging in some ways. Then I want to talk about a web essay that I often assign. And the thing that is interesting to me about the web essay is how little it differs from a typical essay. I don't know why I would even need to call it a web essay in some ways. So if you use a typical content management system like Blackboard or something of that ilk, you could ask students to paste their Microsoft Word essay into the Blackboard page or something that is actually a web platform and not really change a whole lot. Or you could say, well, instead of pasting it in, why not just compose there? There's a spell check. You could compose right there, or in a Google document, something along those lines. So to compose on the web is really not that crazy. So what does it mean to call something a web essay? My thinking there when I gave this assignment was compose this in our class website, but it's an essay that you're writing. And the fact that you're composing it on the web does open possibilities that you could use some different materials. You can do this in Microsoft Word very easily by inserting an image, a chart. It's not that you're limited to words in a word processor. But I think when you move to the web space, and given the amount of materials that are out there on the web, it can open some new possibilities. So this is a video about one student's exploration of that, of those possibilities. This is a screenshot of the web essay that he came up with, and you can see there's some text and there's a video clip that he put in there. What's interesting is the process through which he arrived at that understanding. So he documents this, and he begins when he's explaining how he composed his web essay by hearkening back to his traditionalism. His mode is normally to write essays. He's an English major. So he started by talking about how comfortable he is with print-based essays, and he uses an example of that. Then honestly, this was not a seamless project for him. He starts thinking about Wagner, and as he's putting together a reflection on the essay, he starts to talk about the trouble that he had with this genre. So he has this urge to go back to write about something that he's more comfortable with. Then he talks about an epiphany or an insight that he had when encountering adaptation studies. So he had a more or less blank screen trying to figure out how do I make a web essay, and he stumbled across this notion of adaptation studies, and as you go a little further, as he's reflecting on his project, he encountered an article about adaptation studies, and essentially what he discovered was a rationale that was going to make this web essay actually happen for him. So it really isn't enough to say, well, now you can write an essay in a web space and therefore you can plug whatever you want into it. Some students are comfortable with a lot of leeway in assignments, but they have to discover that rationale by themselves unless you provide it for them. So essentially, once he realized that this notion of films and how they can be adapted from text might drive his essay, then he went out and started looking for the materials that would work, and that's when all of these things on YouTube, these images, these articles, all of the animations, any kind of materials that are on the web make sense once you plug them in, and then eventually his essay turned out that he was able to put it together now without this sense of being lost, and once he had that rationale. Quickly, I will show you a web-based example of what that looks like, because it does raise some challenges. This is not Sean's essay. This is another student's essay. But one of the things that happens then is you want to start thinking about, I now have a rationale for why I might use media within this essay, mix my words with media. Then there's still the implementation of that. How am I going to go about doing that? And one of the challenges is thinking about how these things can be transferred to other modes of writing. And I use analogies quite a bit. So in terms of helping students understand how best to approach this project, I'll make an analogy with quotations. So if a student wants to embed a video clip that shows a scene from the film that they're talking about, they could treat it as a quotation. And just as when you add a quotation into your print essay, you can't just walk away from it and assume that the reader takes away the points that you intend them to take away from that quotation. So you need to give it context, you need to discuss it, and build it into the composition that you do. By the same token, you don't want to completely repeat what the quotation says. If it's saying it in a strong way, then you can let those words work and then extend them into your essay. And that's what happens here. So there's this clip that she's gotten from YouTube. She makes notes to readers that I'll be discussing this clip up until the 2:19 mark. And then as she takes off after playing the clip, she starts talking about it, describing it. What elements of it do I really want you to pay attention to? So there's this weaving that students will encounter and become comfortable with as they start to create these kinds of essays that bring various forms of media together. And this is not that hard to implement. I mean, if you already are using a Blackboard program, there are embed options in there where you can actually add a YouTube clip to a screen on Blackboard. You can obviously make links and embed images, so you don't need to learn really any new technology in order to do these kinds of essays, but they do open up a lot of possibilities for asking these types of questions. So that's 3 genres so far. We looked at a mashup, and the mashup, I think, introduces some points about how you should approach mixing genres or creating assignments that blend different activities and challenges. And then the screencast is where we worked against the grain and talked about how could you maybe use something meant for one type of activity and twist it around and use it for something else. And then the web essay is a more subtle and easily doable mixed genre that just actually blends different modes in some ways, words, video, images, material, sound. So those are the three possibilities. Then the last project that I want to show you is kind of a mashup of one of those composing modes, the screencast, with a typical, maybe not a typical academic genre, but a genre that teachers and students often work with, which is the portfolio. So my assignment was essentially sort of a mashup of a screencast and a portfolio. And we can look at that one here. One of the things that you'll see, this is the student had toward the end of the semester, 5 or 6 projects from the course, and the screencasting software is actually very valuable for that, because if you want to go back and show someone, this is what my essay looked like, this is what my mashup looked like, if you record that on the screen, you're able to recapture it in a way that allows you to pinpoint the parts that you want to talk about. You don't just dump it on somebody. You actually go in and you rework those materials again and put them into a new composition. One of the things that portfolios do is they allow students to work, they allow students to demonstrate things that don't show up on the stapled paper that gets turned in. So the process that went in to creating a project can be delineated in a portfolio and described, and as that process is being described, elements of learning can be touched on, talk about effort, talk about growth. Portfolios are really valuable for doing all of that, and you can see that at the beginning of her portfolio she notes that this is really about a process of composing. And then the portfolio tracks the way that she composed some of these projects. It's hard to see, but she's using some of the typical screencasting moves of typing, so points that she wanted to make, rather than, in a typical print essay, you would type those up. If you were talking to someone, you would just mention them. Here she types them and then records that typing and makes a point about how that influenced her composing process. And then, please excuse the technical difficulties. We're typing here. Okay. And then she starts to reflect on the composing that she has done with these projects. The image that you see here is a screencast. You can see some of the screencasting software, which records what's happening on the screen and then gives you a timeline where you compose. So she was composing by recording some images from Google Earth. She wanted to make a point about places, and so she recorded some Google Earth images and made that part of her screencast, and notes the, how she spent her time while doing that. And we'll look at some other reflections that she has. One of the things that portfolios are also really valuable for, especially with these kinds of projects that I'm showing, are they allow students to succeed in circumstances that sometimes raise particular challenges for them. So I don't want to give the wrong impression that all you need to do is turn on a computer and students can compose these. The challenges tend to be technical sometimes more than conceptual. So Hannah's difficulty was that she had a 4-year-old computer. Students who arrive on campus get a laptop, and 4 years later they are faced with some particular challenges. So she was trying to do this on a 4-year-old computer, which didn't prevent her from doing the project, but she notes here that she had to restart the computer occasionally. It would freeze. A lot of these things that we're not unfamiliar with from our own work, where stuff just isn't quite working all the time. And she's keeping track of that in her portfolio. This is a screen from her mashup. So she too made a mashup assignment. She took the notebook and mashed it up with Night of the Living Dead, and it turned out to actually fit reasonably well. The point that that she makes in the portfolio is this notion of the way that the editing became very absorbing. And this is, I think, reinforces the point about when you find the right mix of challenge and familiarity, you can get this motivation happening among students, and they'll spend hours and hours working on these projects, and the time just seems to kind of slip away. So it's not uncommon. And then here we go. She's talking about the screencast that she recorded here itself and how it developed into something that was a little different. So she's noting, she started saying this portfolio is about process and going through repetition, and she's arriving at a new understanding that this isn't what I actually began wanting to write about. And she clarifies that a little bit. She says, I intended to talk about a kind of obsessiveness in composing. And as she moves along, she says, but instead this is about the messiness behind the scenes, which as a writing instructor I find that very rewarding. I don't think it's, I don't know, unfamiliar to us that actually anyone who thinks that a polished product is really what we're working on is, missing some opportunities by really trying to help students see the way that these products come into being. And then at the end, her computer crashes one more time. You can see that, and she captures it, and she says, which is okay too. So one of the things that I like about this is internalizing some of the lessons that I would offer her as a composer, that things might not always work out the way you want. Something could go wrong. Stay flexible, and you'll probably find that you come out with a rewarding project in the end. So I think I'll stop there. I want to make sure that there are enough questions. If you go back to the web page that I've set up, you can link to all 4 of these projects. And then the other thing that I would point you toward is this is a pre-publication draft of an article listed at that address right there. And if you go look at that article, you can see a bunch of these screencast and mashup projects that some students have put together, and then the article is co-written with some students as well, and it talks about portfolios and the way that screencasts enact performance. So a lot of what I've talked about today you can glean from this pre-publication piece right there. And I think I'm going to stop, and I do want to have some time for questions. I will point out that if you're interested in other mixed genres, there's examples of playlists, audio essays, web essays. There are links to some assignments that you can employ in your own courses. The assignment for the mashup you'll find is a little bit thin because I tend to handle some of that in class itself. But I think that's it.
Great. Thanks so much, Dan. There are a couple questions about open source applications that you would recommend for some of these assignments, and then a couple questions about whether you include kind of step-by-step or click path types of instructions for these assignments for your students.
Okay. Yeah, the choice of software is an interesting conundrum in some ways. Things like the mashups, it turns out that you can use the bundled software on your computer for the most part. iMovie, Windows Movie Maker, those are perfectly adequate for taking a movie trailer and cutting it up and or incorporating audio from a trailer. So for those types of things, I actually am a big fan of using consumer-oriented applications, and I think what happens with those is it's important to not aim for Hollywood-style production quality on some of these projects. When you go listen to some of these, you'll find occasionally a student moves too far away from the microphone and the quality of the voice will switch, things of that nature. So I think what happens when you use the consumer-oriented video editors is students gain access to the moves and the literacies. The idea of putting a video transition in somewhere allows them to think about how you mix materials, and you can't just randomly switch from one to another. Sometimes you need a transition. So they can get access to the literacies with the basic programs. I don't think that free video editors have open source video editors have gotten to the point that some of the open source word processors or image editors have, or audio editors too as well. But the consumer ones that are free with your computer are fine. The screencasting is a little bit more challenging. There are free options out there. For Mac, there's one called iShowU. There's a web-based screen recording program called Jing. You can go to that, and I would encourage people to just try that because it's free and it's actually very straightforward. You can record what happens on your screen easily. When it comes to trying to edit the screen recordings, there are programs that cost money. The one that I use is Camtasia, and that now has a Mac version as well. The nice part about Camtasia is it comes with a 30-day free trial. So, for instance, we have about 30 days left in the semester right now, and I'm asking my students to begin working on screencasting projects. They'll download the 30-day trial, use it for the rest of the semester, and then, you know, if they really enjoy the software, they can buy it on their own, but they don't have to purchase it for this 30 days.
That's great. Thanks, Dan. Emily Beard at Bowling Green State has an interesting question about the self-reflection. She writes, the sample student slides appear to have quite a bit of self-reflection. Is the reflection something you specifically ask students to do in composing these projects, or do you find that your students tend to reflect naturally during their work on these projects?
Yeah, Emily, that was deliberate. I asked them to compose 2 screencasts, and another thing related to these is sometimes repetition is helpful. So their first screencast was about was an essay, create an essay as a screencast, and you saw the one about the Vietnam War, and Watchmen pretty much followed that. I always have students do portfolios, and typically they've been traditional portfolios where they reflect in writing and, you know, select portions of their projects to include in the portfolio. But this was just something I decided to try. What if I actually have them record their reflections with the screencasting software? So the later projects and the one also about the web essay that I was showing you were their portfolio screencasts, and that's why they have such so much reflection in them.
Thanks, Dan. We have a couple questions, related questions from Michelle Wagner. She's wondering, first, what textbook do you use to complement or create these kinds of assignments? And second, do your students engage in online learning groups for peer response to these kinds of projects?
Okay. Yeah, textbooks, you know, I have a book, and my assignments are all kind of come out of that, although generally I fidget with assignments and customize them for each semester. So the assignments, I create them myself in a lot of ways. The class website is a huge part of what we do. If you go to some of those projects that are linked in there, and actually if you want to email me or just browse around on the websites that are linked in various places, you'll see some of the course websites that I've set up. I use Drupal software, but you can accomplish this with the content management system that your institution offers. But every one of these projects gets uploaded to the course website, and then the students give feedback to one another. I give them feedback. And the reason we use portfolios is we always revise the project throughout the entire course of the semester, and the online space really functions well for that. It's important because in some ways asking students to do things that are less familiar, they have to take some risks, and the online space gives this a place where they can demonstrate what they're doing and take the risks and get feedback from one another. So we do that all the time, and then they continue to revise these things throughout the semester, and then when they turn in their portfolio, they've gone through 3 or 4 drafts with feedback from peers using the online space.
Great. Thanks a lot, Dan. I think that's about all we have time for, so thank you, everyone, for attending, and thank you so much, Dan, for your excellent ideas and for your time today.
Great. I would invite anyone to contact me. I'm happy to talk about this more with people.
Thank you.
Great. Thanks.
We'll be starting up again in about 20 minutes with our next session, Bowling Alone as Team Sport, helping students engage in an online course with Lynn McNeil.